Hi, this is Derek Harp, the founder and chairman of CSA and the host of many of the Wednesday CSA events and the CSA podcast show. And today is a fun mashup of sort of both. We had an awesome event on March 18th about critical around CIE, cyber informed engineering. It was called Fortifying Critical Functions Using Cyber Informed Engineering, or CIE. And I had two great guests on. Ginger Wright from the Idaho National Laboratory and Ben Lampe from the Idaho National Laboratory. And we talked about it. So I think what we probably ought to do, because not everybody listening to our podcast was at the event, is sort of back up and just frame up the body of work. Some people I find as I talk to them, they've heard of it, or they think they've heard of it, or they say, "Is that cyber informed engineering? Is that the same as secure by design?" And so, it's not, it's some fuzzy areas on how things are defined. So maybe if you guys would reframe it, that we're gonna answer some questions that came up during Q&A that we didn't get to that day, but they're ones that could be of broad interest to anybody in our industry that is interested in this area. And last but not least, they're both speaking at level zero. We're only 24, 25 days away from the conference in Atlanta, Georgia, on the Georgia Tech campus, a well-known engineering school. So there's a lot of awesome tie-ins. And so we'll finish up at the end and just summarize, but there's opportunities to come learn directly from Ben and Ginger in Atlanta between the 19th and the 22nd of 23rd or 4th of April. So why don't we start back at the top then, Ginger, Ben?
So, hi, I'm Ginger Wright. I am the Chief Cyber Informed Engineering Enthusiast. And Ben Lampe, my colleague, is with me. Say hi, Ben.
Hi everyone. As Ginger, I am her underling to support the wonderful work we're doing with cyber informed engineering.
So, with an introduction for those who have not heard of cyber informed engineering, and again, stay far away from me because you'll hear about it if you're within my vicinity at all. This takes traditional cybersecurity, but looks at it through the lens of an engineer. Often with critical infrastructure, the processes, the systems, the outcomes that we're trying to secure exist both in the digital arena and the physical arena. And our engineers who have for years installed devices that make those processes autonomous or apply automation in those processes, they understand what are the worst things that could happen? What are the consequences if something happened in that process that would make our company go out of business, that would harm the public, that would make it so our product wasn't available anymore? And often when we think about cybersecurity, we're so focused in the digital world, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information that we forget about that physical world so closely attuned to it that the digital technology is controlling. So cyber informed engineering lets an engineer put in those priorities that come from the knowledge of the process and the knowledge of the systems that perform the process and help us prioritize how we're applying cybersecurity and adding engineered controls that really prevent an adversary from creating those most harmful consequences. Ben, would you like to say more about it?
Yeah, and to build on that, you see that what we're introducing is really an extension of what organizations have available when thinking about how they're responding to digital risk. And I say it very plainly to say, don't just treat cyber against cyber. Because we live in a cyber physical reality, especially with our control systems, our response plans, our control schemes can benefit from a cyber physical response, not just a cyber against cyber response.
How long does the CIE project go back?
So we began cyber informed engineering actually in 2017 or 2018. We wrote a very immature document about applying this specifically in light water reactor plants. As digitization began to come into light water reactor plants, we felt like they had the best advantage because they were so used to engineered systems. As long as they kept some of the abilities to manually control those processes, the introduction of digitization wouldn't affect their ability to be safe or responsive to the process. And then since then, in 2020, Congress directed the Department of Energy to create a cyber informed engineering strategy. And they brought a group together to think about what would it mean if we had engineers actively involved in the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure? What would they do? And then how should the Department of Energy make that information available to the public? What should DOE focus on? So out of that, in 2022, they published a cyber-informed engineering strategy that had instructions for the Department of Energy about how to implement this program and described what this group of wonderful security thinkers thought was important. They told us, raise awareness. No one thinks about calling an engineer for a cybersecurity planning endeavor. We always call the cybersecurity people because that's how we think and that's what our standards say. They said that we need to get this into education so that engineers that are graduating from accredited universities understand how to be properly suspicious of digital technology in terms of its ability to add to engineering risk and not to become cyber experts themselves, but to ask the questions of others who are about how cyber accidents or cyber incidents can affect processes that they depend on. They then said, go create tools to make this easier because the national labs are really good at doing a lot of the big thinking, but the easy button is often out of our grasp. So they deliberately told us, make tools, make it easier, make it something that people can understand, and then go apply it. Apply it to the critical infrastructure that's in place now, but also to that new infrastructure that DOE may be thinking about. Whatever the next generation reactor project should be, it should have cyber-informed engineering cooked into it from the very, very beginning of the research phase. And so Ben and I have been working on that direction since that strategy was published.
So what is the relationship between CIE and Secure by Design as far as terminology goes?
So Secure by Design is an effort to ensure that the digital products that we produce are made to be as resistant to cyber attack as possible. And that means using secure coding standards. It means keeping component infrastructures up to date. It means really being intentional as a product creator about the creation of the product and the security implications of those decisions. Where cyber-informed engineering is different is I want secure technology. I want to buy secure technology that's made secure, but often when I'm an asset owner and I've got a power plant that's depending upon this critical software, the vendor is only responsible for what their product can do. I have a shared responsibility with that vendor to incorporate their product in a secure way and to build defenses around it to ensure that there isn't a consequence an adversary could enact through that product that would have a bad impact for me. So where Secure by Design looks largely at product creation and the vendor's responsibility, cyber-informed engineering looks at this through a lens of a shared responsibility model, where yes, the vendor should be making the most secure products possible, but the asset owner ultimately owns the consequences for those worst case scenarios and may have to buttress the security of the products they buy with additional protections. Ben, did I miss anything there?
You can start to see how CIE really helps deliver the resilience side of this conversation, where Secure by Design is that preventative measure, where you're just trying to outright prevent the situation from occurring. But given the assumption that the situation can occur, what can we do to control that resilient outcome? And that's an engineering problem, and that often benefits from your understanding of the physical side of this equation. I think also the other point that I like to throw in is it's always good until it's not good. And what I mean by that is it takes oftentimes a misconfiguration or a 0 day to often bypass the countermeasures we implement from that Secure by Design mindset. And so in that, it helps kind of demonstrate that both are necessary to truly deliver kind of the cyber resilience that has become kind of the hot term these days, as kind of why we're doing what we're doing and why the organization requires both the cyber professional and the engineer in a successful organizational, I'm getting a little creative in my language, demonstrates a strong maturity to this problem.
Do you guys have a example? I'd like to bring maybe people who aren't familiar with the term in this body of work straight into something like, well, what do they mean by this? Like an example of, look, this isn't a cybersecurity staff or person or technology. We're going to engineer out a risk. Now, it's a risk that somebody coming in as a cyber threat, risk, threat actor might try to take advantage or be able to cause something to happen. We're going to engineer that risk out. What would be an example of that?
So Ben, I'm going to turn this question over to you. You've created a database with 62,000 examples, and I saw you looking at one this morning that I wondered if you'd want to tell us about.
Sure. And just because I'm an engineer, I'll say it's 62,473 to be exact, but who's counting,
Wow,
really?
I love it.
More to come, where we're currently stewarding a potential version 3, where we're trying to go deeper than taxonomy currently exists. So more to come on that, but getting to an example directly. Oftentimes when you think about the use of digital technology like a PLC to control the actuation of any asset, whether it's a pump or a motor or a turbine, one of the things that we need to be sensitive to is the fact that an on-off command can operate at machine speed through that use of digital technology. And in there, we have a number of different techniques, whether you can use some engineered controls within the asset, like some type of thermal relay, a thermocouple type apparatus inside of a motor to kind of disconnect when thermal activity rises to a certain threshold. The challenge there is sometimes when that stuff blows, you have to replace it. And the question now is how easily can that be replaced? That kind of that mean time to repair component, which is a very noticeable conversation there. So one of the things we always talk about is what can you do from a systematic level to help control that outcome where an adversary is able to allow the digital technology or manipulate the digital technology to operate at speed that was never commissioned for. And that's where we've always, in a booster pump station dynamic, introduced a time delay component that sits in the analog space, the physical space, to really slow down and ensure the system stays within the operational processes, both from a procedure standpoint, but just from a commissioning standpoint, that's always held true, even if the adversary has gotten to a place in the system where they can invoke that kind of machine speed dynamic. The one that Ginger was alluding to earlier is part of our design pattern work. I'm developing an example around a turbine control, where the turbine control is given the command to just give full power, but full power is too much power for the situation that turbine is installed. So I'm using a tachometer, which is really an acceleration sensor, in combination with some switch thresholds in the electronic circuit. And without kind of going too deep, just for time's sake, that threshold allows the turbine to trip off to ensure that from a protection of safety, we don't suffer from a common mode failure, because our original solution used digital technology to trip that signal. So you can see we're bringing that functional safety perspective and kind of ensuring that we're really targeting the fact that as we introduce more and more digital technology, we're not reintroducing common mode failures as part of our functional safety certifications and kind of safety levels that we're certifying a given system to uphold and operate to. Ginger, I'll hand it back over to you.
On our March 18th conversation, we also went through an example that had a water plant moving some control software into the cloud. And their concern was that even with all the great security in place, if an adversary got in and turned the water pumps on and off and on and off and on and off, that could cause damage to the pump and potentially an 18-month outage. And in this case, something as simple as a time delay relay, think about it as a kitchen timer for commands that holds a command until the amount of time has passed and then will allow another command to go through. That would throttle what an adversary could do. So even though they could turn the pump on or off, it slows them down enough to make sure that the damage doesn't occur and that our incident response team can get out and fix the problem, even though the adversary is active in the system. So those are two good examples.
That's an elegant example because it's the that's what's driving all this is we need to be able to get to that and turn it off from over here remotely. That solution doesn't cut that off. It just says, hey, as long as we're on the same page, do you need to turn it on and off every millisecond? No, we don't. Okay, let's agree on a time. You still achieve your mission, but we've now completely eliminated this particular risk because it's now just not possible, and you didn't need that functionality anyway, or undocumented functionality.
Right. And even
Yeah,
if it's an intern that I'm worried about instead of an adversary, someone who just doesn't know any better and clicks the buttons on and off, I'm
yeah.
protected against them too. Or if it was AI and somehow an undesired autonomy started having AI issue commands to the system that could put it in that danger zone, this prevents that AI from doing it as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Our annual report shows every year that internal threat is the biggest category, and that nation states and hacktivists and cyber criminals all definitely on the grow. But compared to the biggest group is insiders, and there's two categories of them: malicious insiders, and then the even biggest group, the winner, the non-malicious insiders. So I think you're absolutely right. We're protecting against risk, not cyber attackers. That's way too specific, right?
That's right. We want to eliminate undesired consequences from happening. So we're trying to control risk. If you break it down, is probability times impact. So probability being the chance that I can get to the right place to do something, and then impact, the consequence of what I do. So, what traditional cybersecurity does is it really acts on probability. It puts the equivalent of an obstacle course in front of the adversary. Okay, now if you want to get in my system, you have to climb this mountain and swim through this lake and get through the pit of fire or whatever the obstacles are so that you can get to a point to have an impact. With cyber informed engineering, okay, you've got to that place, you're about to unleash that impact, and no, nothing happens. There is no earth shattering kaboom. We've engineered out even your chance at success. So at that point, the adversary trudges home defeated, and everybody on our side is happy about that.
Well, let's do three of questions that I know the three of us talked about that we didn't really get to that were good questions, and that'll be great for the people that were at the event, but also certainly they're interesting things for anybody that's now paying attention to this topical area. So, um, Samir asked, "What lacks in 62443 is a clear definition of what steps to follow after SL are assigned. Has CISA or CIE identified any such steps?"
Ben, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, and I won't speak for CISA since we're not CISA. We're coming from the Department of Energy side within that program of cyber informed engineering directly. And I'll freely admit 62443 is big enough that when I'm going to give something, it's certainly my opinion, and I'm still learning as much as all of us are about this world of 62443. But when I look at the standard, when I read through the workflow that they have, right, we got to remember security levels are defined in three types. You have both the target, what's actually achieved, and what's the capability of the assets that are involved in kind of that security level conversation. So let's assume we've set a target. The challenge, right, is that target really frames the question around how good is that adversary? So you can see we're pivoting, we're really taking hold of that traditional cyber thinking about, can we quantify the adversary? Can we quantify the threats and the vulnerabilities? And you can see how we're taking that traditional cyber approach and we're saying, what can we do from that information security to buy down that risk? But what CIE always continues to promote is the key assumption is we assume compromise. We assume whatever we're doing on the InfoSec is able to be bypassed. And we have clear evidence of that time and time again. Like I said, misconfigurations, 0 days are late weaknesses that probably will never go away. More than likely will never go away. I hate using absolutes, but I'm feeling pretty strong about that assertion. So it shows you that even in that conversation, part of an organization's ability to buy down that risk is shift the conversation to consequence. And this is why we say that the next steps from any of that conversation, any of organization following that process, is what can we do by introducing engineered controls to buy down that consequence? Because the theory, right, is if I can shift that consequence down to a risk acceptance, it opens me up to my conversation of what I'm doing on the likelihood reduction side. It's saying we're doing both sides, but it allows us to have more freedom or flexibility of what makes sense for the constraints and the reality of our control system. So I'll leave it at that. Ginger, if you have any other color, feel free.
I like that. I can spend less time figuring out, how many mountains and how many swimming across what lakes and how many pits of fire, and focus on, I've controlled the ability for them to do harm. Now I need to control the probability that they get in at all, but I can make really good decisions about what tools I use to do that.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, awesome. Another one we talked about is this consequence analysis, essentially FMEA. And for people that aren't familiar with it, failure mode and effects analysis. Is that true? Is that right?
I'll jump in that first, and then Ginger, you can add in afterwards. So I love this question because you're absolutely right. But it speaks to another core tenet of how we approach this cyber-informed engineering kind of problem. Cyber-informed engineering sets the stage. It provides the lens by which you can now look at the problem. And what we're arguing for is the consideration of digital risk in your risk assessment, right? Where traditional engineering would do risk assessment against environmental risk, against operational risk, against kind of the component risk, that mean time to failure characteristic. And we organize around that kind of that physical understanding and the risk assessment. But our response allows us to adopt digital technology to help control that problem. But it doesn't take responsibility for the digital risk we've now just introduced by adopting digital technology. So while failure mode effects analysis is a great risk assessment technique amongst many others, like 62443 or HAZOP or LOPA, or kind of pick your acronym there, STPA. I mean, the list goes on and on. But what we're arguing for is take those risk assessment techniques and ensure you enforce the consideration of digital risk. But even in that consideration, know that you have both information security as a response and cyber-informed engineering as another key response to control, like we said earlier, both the probability side and the consequence side. And by incorporating digital risk, we're now extending these already established, well-known consequence analysis techniques with that consideration. And kind of a sign of good maturity in organization is to have that direct kind of behavior when thinking about digital risk. It's not just a cyber professional problem, and it's not just an engineering problem. It's an organizational problem that brings both families together. Ginger, I'll hand it over to you if you have any other.
Okay. And I think cyber-informed engineering asks that we look at consequences from the process and the product perspective, thinking for the organization of, given this system and its critical functions, what would be the bad outcomes? What would be those failure modes and effects on the process? And then look at the digital technology to see if somebody had control of it in the worst way. And maybe they're overclocking it. Maybe they're making it perform more effectively or efficiently than I had planned. But what could they do to it that might induce one of those difficult or horrible consequences for me? And then how would I prevent it? So it's aligned with failure modes and effects analysis, but we have to be careful. We're not thinking about how the digital technology fails, because often that gets us so far into the cybersecurity weeds that we forget our physical process even exists. We're thinking about what could make the process go wrong, and then how do we need to limit what the digital technology can do so that we don't carry that capability into the physical process.
It's interesting. A light bulb sort of went off for me. You guys tell me if this is right or not. We're adding all of this technology and all these connections because we want to accomplish all these different things. But for every 10 thing we want to accomplish, there's 100 unintended consequences. And it's just about thinking, okay, let's accomplish only the 10 things we wanted and not as many of the other things that were not intended by this, you know? And that's it's a throttle, right? It's like let's just come down and only do these things. We're instead of saying sort of the open trust way the internet started, which is like let's make connections everywhere. This is let's just assume that we don't want things to happen other than the four things that we've decided we want to do, right?
Yes, it's almost, thinking back, I was also, old enough to be there when the internet started, and how excited that I was that anything could talk to anything
Yeah,
and we could connect anything to it. I could find out how many Cokes are in the Coke machine, or what temperature is the coffee at Berkeley. Like, I need to know that. And because general purpose computers made everything easy to do and everything possible, I just had to reprogram them to do that. That means engineering suddenly becomes hard to control. Wherever I put digital technology in, I'm opening that control loop up to a number of possibilities that the engineer that designed the process never even thought about.
yeah,
So with cyber informed engineering, we're again sort of throttling this, as you said, back into the physical constraints that we want this to do, and then figuring out how we can still leverage the capability, the speed, all the things we want out of digital technology, but shave off those parts of it that cause unintended hazardous consequences for us.
yeah. Makes sense. All right, one more from South Africa. I loved how this question asker disclosed where he's coming from, he or she. As an MSP, we handle the day-to-day IT for engineering firms. In your CIE roadmap, where do you see the biggest operational handoff gap between the engineering design team and the managed service provider who has to maintain those systems long term? In 10 seconds or less, go.
Ben?
Yeah.
No, no.
Well, when I look back at some of the principles that are part of kind of that CIE worldview, Principle 11 is about engineering information control, and so I think I'm trying to put my feet in their shoes. If I was their MSP, what I'm called to do is manage their IT operation. I'm managing their data platforms that they're using to design systems they're active projects. So this is not necessarily a production system in a process sense, but it's certainly the environment by which successful design that informs successful implementation of process systems is kind of the lane that this MSP is in. So that's why I go to engineering information control. Data governance, data protection is not a new concept. That's a key tenet of traditional cyber. But what's often missing is that engineering understanding of, when you look at engineering information, what's the conversation I need to have so I'm not, in a sense, releasing information that makes the adversary's job easier when they're trying to follow the ICS attack chain, plan an attack, and execute an attack. And we can have that conversation between the engineering firm and the MSP to say, your data protection program needs to have this type of understanding, because the data you're protecting is not just like financial data, or not just like personal identifiable PP or PII, personal identifiable information. It's system identified information that we want to protect, and that conversation, I think, is promoted specifically through Principle 11. But I my bias in engineering controls, and this starts to get a little outside my purview. But Ginger, do you have any insight there from more of the organizational or process people conversation?
Sure. From a process perspective, I think handing off to that managed service provider an insight on what the physical operations are, I did a lot of work in textiles and I would write programs and think I was doing the right thing. But my first trip to a textile plant and seeing how every part of it was laid out, how the yarn was spun, how the work was done, suddenly my ability to detect nuance and deal with nuance and how I provided services went through the roof. So to me, that handoff of making sure that managed service provider understands the actual business, the processes, the key high consequence events and critical functions of the business they're supporting is crucial.
Well, I know we could talk longer because we went 90 minutes during the CSA Wednesday at One event. But I think this was great. We touched on some things. Why don't we finish out just touching on level zero? Obviously, Ginger, you were a few people were there at the what I would call the nucleus breakfast that led to we're doing a whole conference, and now we're getting ready to do the second one here coming up soon, 25 days away, April 20, 21, and 22. And we said in that first meeting, what are some of the things this conference should be about? And one was, content for constituents or segments of our workforce that might not come to a cybersecurity conference ever. And engineers is that's a group, that's a big group, and CIE being a huge body of work that is talked about in different places, but that should be one of the pillars, if you will, that this conference at Level Zero is based on. And so last year we did some content on it. You spoke. But now, this year, we're doing even more. And so maybe just give a quick rundown of the three things you guys are doing on Zero Day during the conference and then after the conference closes.
Hey, thank you. And Derek, I am so excited at the success that Level Zero has been and really excited for this year. There have been so many great conversations that happened at that conference that led to good research for me. And I know good outcomes for others because I hear about it all year long. So this year, 2026, we decided that on day zero of level zero, so the Sunday before the main event happened, we would sign up to do a 4-hour cyber informed engineering training. And for those thinking about going, I will say you have an incredible buffet of training offerings to pick from. Ours is just one of them, but attendees will get hands deep in cyber informed engineering. They will practice doing some of these trade-offs themselves in a real system metaphor so that they can understand how to apply the principles and what questions to ask and what it might be to do this on a real project. Then during the conference itself, about in the middle, because we had to have bookends and something in the middle, I'm doing a talk on cyber conservative operations. And the idea behind cyber conservative operations is we know from a physical operations standpoint that when we're entering a frail time as an operation, maybe it's maintenance season, maybe it's the middle of the summer and we have to put out production, we know that we curtail things that are not absolutely necessary so that they don't distract us from doing the mission that we have to do during that difficult time. Well, what if in cybersecurity we had that same idea and that we had plans in advance so that when we were in a heavy threat season or when we were operationally frail, we could curtail attack surface and make it less available to an attacker. So I'll introduce that idea in the talk and then talk about some ways, some examples of how someone might do that and how that might work. And then at the very end, Ben is going to do a workshop for design patterns in cyber informed engineering. Ben?
Yep. And so with that, it's going to be a 4-hour workshop on that Thursday morning. So I'd encourage anybody attending Level Zero, if you have a flight that afternoon, spend the morning with us at the conference site, going through what we're calling cyber-informed design patterns. Just like we saw in software design patterns, right? There's commonalities to how we approach these problems. And so we're framing this as examples that we've seen across many different sectors on how engineers approach responding to digital risk, both in technology solutions, in process procedures, how we approach kind of organizing people around our systems, or even how we design the facility themselves. We can explore the common ways we've seen Even though the specifics are unique to a given sector, there's still common ways to understand this problem. And so we want to codify those. And so I think the workshop will be very fruitful, just to get kind of that sanity check and to bring people into that recognition of this is our community responding and providing that guidance for the world to adopt, and how we're kind of allowing the engineer to think about digital risk.
Awesome. So, as Ginger said, the day zero is Sunday, April 19th, and it's all day, starts at 9 a.m. Day two of the conference, which is Tuesday, the 21st, Ginger's workshop will be at 9. And then Virginia and Ben will do the larger group workshop on Thursday, the 24th. And that is open to anyone in the community. I mean, anyone that wants to come. You don't have to have had a conference pass. It's after the conference closes on Wednesday. So this is a workshop using the facility. We've already got it. We're on Georgia Tech's campus. Come in and deep dive and, bring anybody that wants to attend, right?
It's the 23rd to be exact. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, Thursday the 23rd.
21, 22, 23. No, oh, yeah, 23. It looks like my little cheat sheet here is not right. Okay.
Yep.
Good catch. So go to levelzeroconference.com, and there's where everything officially is. And obviously you could reach out. There's ways to contact us, and there's the agenda and all these sorts of things. But good catch, Ben. Okay. Yeah, so thank you very much, both of you, for doing the event for CSA. Made an awesome Wednesday event. And we'll just keep this annual theme of growing the the attention on this great body of work that you guys are dedicated to, but also coming on today and for being an integral part of Level Zero. So I owe you a lot, and I know the community will does benefit and will benefit from everything you do. So thank you again for that.
And thank you, Derek. If those listening haven't heard enough about cyber-informed engineering, you can find more information on inl.gov/CIE. And we have tons of resources there for your use, free of charge. And we'd love to hear back about your adventures with cyber-informed engineering.